As summer approaches, Russia and Ukraine step up their attacks. Reaching more than 1,500 kilometers, a Ukrainian drone hits President Putin's hometown. Meanwhile, Russian strikes have killed and injured dozens more across Ukraine. So is the worst of this conflict still to come? I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is the Newsmakers. On Wednesday, just as Russia's flagship St. Petersburg Economic Forum got underway, a Ukrainian drone hit 2 targets in the city. Security deteriorated in Kiev as well, where thousands of residents slept in subway stations fleeing Russian airstrikes. Further afield, a Russian drone hit a residential building in Romania, a NATO member, while concerns grow over Belarus providing a launch pad for attacks on Ukraine. All this after more than 4 years of efforts to broker a ceasefire. So are we actually getting further from peace in Europe's eastern flank? Here's a look.
It was a bold move, a dramatic attack, and embarrassing optics for the Russian president. Ukrainian drones targeted the outskirts of St. Petersburg on Wednesday, ahead of the start of an international conference with delegates from 130 countries. Vast plumes of black smoke rose above St. Petersburg's skyline, hours before the economic forum, nicknamed the Davos of Russia, was set to begin. Vladimir Putin himself was scheduled to address the gathering later in the week. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said Russia would retaliate.
I'd like to remind you of the statement from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which said that our responses will be systematic in nature. And indeed, they already are.
In Kiev, the Ukrainian president praised the armed forces for their progress in being able to attack Russia at long range.
And I think, thank God, that today we have such security guarantees that allow us to end this war on equal footing with the Russians in any diplomatic format.
He also hosted NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in Kiev on Wednesday. The NATO Secretary General was there partly to reassure the Ukrainian president on his repeated requests for the US to supply more Patriot missiles to Ukraine more quickly.
The United States, I believe, is doing what it can in terms of delivering Pack 3 and Pack 2 Patriot missiles to Ukraine. I really believe that, based on all the evidence I have.
Not only was Wednesday's drone strike on St. Petersburg considered a success, but in recent weeks, Ukraine has been stepping up drone attacks on Russia with increasing frequency. Ukraine has successfully struck at Russian naval ships in ports, as well as fossil fuel industry sites, which has impacted Moscow's main funding source for continuing the war. Ukrainian forces also appear to be on their best footing on the battlefield in years, as Russia's spring offensive has lost major momentum, making only negligible territorial gains in Ukraine's east. Russia accused Ukraine of killing 8 civilians after striking a bus with a drone in the Russian-controlled Donetsk region in eastern Ukraine. But Ukraine has also come under increased attack from Russia as Moscow switches gear from ground invasion to airstrikes. Dozens of civilians were killed in Kiev and other cities and towns across Ukraine.
It clearly shows also panic on Russian side. Why they are increasing the terrorist attacks that they're doing in Ukraine is because they don't know what to do with these things.
Zelensky warned in recent weeks that Russian attacks may be staged from Belarus. Their leader, Alexander Lukashenko, a vocal supporter and ally of the Russian president. Russia and Belarus staged joint nuclear drills in mid-May. Around the same time, Kiev officials showcased wreckage of drones and missiles which comprised Russian and Belarusian components. At the end of May, a Russian drone hit a block of flats in a Romanian town near the Ukrainian border. Romanian authorities tried to reassure the public that this was not a direct attack by Russia on Romania, but likely a drone that Ukraine intercepted, which was knocked off course before it crashed in Romania. The Russian president has shown no obvious signs his focus on Ukraine is slowing down. But his aims and practical realities on the battlefield don't match. Now, more than 4 years since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, an obvious slowdown in Russian advancement and strikes deep into Russian territory from Kiev is providing a palpable morale boost for Ukrainians as the country gains what it sees as more leverage in its favour.
Joining me now to debate whether Kyiv has made real gains and how far we are from even a ceasefire, much less actual peace, are from Washington, Senior Fellow and Director of the Future of DHS Project at the Atlantic Council, S Warrick, and from Kyiv, Secretary General of the Independent Anti-Corruption Commission, NAKO, Olena Tregub. Unfortunately, we're having trouble connecting to our guest in Moscow, but if we can reach her during the program, we will bring her into the discussion. But Olena, then let me start with you. You know, the pictures we're seeing out of Kyiv are disturbing, not least the tens of thousands of people sleeping in underground metro stations. So I understand you're still in the heat of this conflict, but do you personally feel good about how Ukraine is performing on the battlefield? Do you feel it's, chipping away at Russian morale and bringing victory somehow closer?
Well, yes, of course. Ukraine has now initiative on the battlefield. Ukraine now developed middle strike drones on its own, which we're now using in a special operation to cut Russian military logistics. And we also now developed our own long strike, deep strike capability, and we are able to hit oil refineries across Russia. So, of course, this is huge development, and there is a huge increase of how many Russian soldiers are lost per square kilometer comparing to even last year. If last year it was around maybe 50, right now it's much more than 100. So, of course, yes, at this stage, Russia will not be able to advance.
Thomas, let me ask you, do you think the kind of confidence is justified? Can the trajectory actually continue for Ukraine?
Well, on the battlefield, Ukraine has had considerable success against the much larger Russian force. Their use of drones is now considered the best in the world. And is being sought after by countries in the Gulf who also face threats from Iranian drones. So that's all in Ukraine's favor. But the Ukrainians are obviously still facing a lot of attacks against civilian targets in Kyiv and other cities. They're also worried about what Belarus is up to. And in one of the more interesting developments, the U.S. House of Representatives overrode the wishes of the Trump administration to offer a new military aid package to Ukraine and additional sanctions on Moscow. So from the standpoint of Kyiv, they're holding on and they can continue to hold on for a long time to come. But a ceasefire seems less likely than a Russian escalation right now.
Okay. Let me ask Olena then, looking at the drones' potential here, how much did it mean to Ukrainians to see, a drone reach more than 1,500 kilometers to specifically Putin's hometown in St. Petersburg on the opening day of what is considered Russia's Davos, the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum? How did that play out across Ukraine?
No, obviously, this is very encouraging for Ukrainians to see. You cannot win the war on the territory of the country that was attacked. And until recently, Ukraine was not able to strike back. So it is very encouraging for Ukrainians to see the strikes on St. Petersburg, on other Russian regions that are far away from Ukraine. And these are capabilities that Ukraine should have had a long time ago from the beginning of the war.
Let me go back to Thomas, because S Warrick, I'd actually like to read what one of Putin's advisors and the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, actually posted on X recently. He said, "Citizens of EU countries, you should realize your authorities have unilaterally entered into a war with Russia. So be vigilant and don't be surprised by anything. The peaceful sleep is over. But you know who to ask why. How seriously should the EU and then by default NATO actually take that warning?
Well, and you could add the veiled threat to U.S. diplomats to leave Kyiv. This is seen as part of a move by Putin to try to escalate or at least threaten the escalation of the war. Putin had done this, you may remember, a couple of years ago when he talked about using nuclear weapons if the United States and NATO countries more strongly backed Ukraine. Yes, he's making threats. Yes, they're being taken somewhat seriously. The prospect of a major Russian attack on NATO, though, is seen as relatively unlikely because it would be very hard for President Trump if there was a major attack on NATO territory. It would be hard for President Trump not to come to NATO's defense in that kind of a scenario. What you may see are more of these so-called accidents, and I put that in quotes because, of course, they're not, where drones enter into NATO countries like Romania or Poland and hit targets, and then Russia claims that they are actually just, they just got away from where they were supposed to go, and not many people believe that. What I think we're seeing is a sort of psychological war by Putin trying to hold back European support for Ukraine. I actually doubt it will have much of an effect because the European countries, number one, they're somewhat limited in the kind of assistance they can give Ukraine, and so they're going to continue to provide that. Yeah. European interest in putting ground troops to monitor a ceasefire, that sort of has waned a little bit. But in effect, this is more of the psychological warfare that Putin is waging against Europe. And I can go through a dozen other examples.
Quickly, though, I mean, you'd cited that we might be getting closer to a ceasefire because of the damage done. But, I mean, the problem with ceasefires, many complain, is that it gives either side time to regroup and restock weapons. So as far as actually ending the conflict is concerned, are we getting further away or closer to it?
Well, remember that wars continue as long as both countries prefer war to peace. And so, in fact, a prospect of a ceasefire actually seems less likely now than it did a couple of years ago when or a year ago when Trump was just newly in office and thought he could solve this war in a day. I think what we're headed for is a kind of military stalemate on the battlefield. Military historians remember any number of campaigns where, faced with a stalemate, one side tries some daring military maneuver to break the stalemate. And that's one of the reasons that Ukrainian leaders are worried about what's going on in Belarus. But it looks like the most likely outcome is continued stalemate throughout 2026.
Okay. Let me ask Olena then, as we said, NATO member Romania was hit by a Russian drone, intentionally or not. 2 weeks ago, Russian jets actually intercepted a Royal Air Force flight. Dmitry Medvedev's post that the peaceful sleep is over, and we know NATO chief Mark Rutte arrived in Kyiv on Wednesday. So, is NATO preparing to take any action here from your perspective? And if not, should they be?
No, I don't think NATO is preparing to take any action, and I don't even see any kind of new developments when it comes to Russian threats to NATO, when it comes to all these incidents of undeclared Russian war against Europe, when there are explosions at the railway, where there are drones, there are sabotage operations, cyber, and so on. It's going on now for years like this. And actually, I would want to disagree with my counterpart that right now there is no chance for ceasefire, and that there was chance for ceasefire when Trump came to office. Actually, no. In my opinion, when Trump came to office and this fake negotiations started at that, I call them fake because Russia was not negotiating in good faith and Russia was not ready for ceasefire at all. It was a show, it was a theater, and there was zero chance for ceasefire. And I was telling this all this time, and as we see, ceasefire didn't happen. However, now, in the next 6 months, Ukrainian commanders, for example, Bieletsky, they say that there is actually little chance for ceasefire right now because now it's different. Now Ukraine acquired capabilities to make painful, consequences for Russia, which we didn't have before. So now if Europe pressures, if America pressures by pressure, I mean additional weapon to Ukraine, sanction on Russia, and then if the pressure would be increased together with Ukrainian kinetic pressure, with Ukrainian strikes, then there would be some chance for ceasefire. Otherwise, yes, I don't also see any possible ceasefire in the near terms.
Okay, Tom, I'll let you respond to that. And also, we have to take into consideration that just today, Russian envoy Kirill Dmitriev says that he spoke directly to U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. That's according to Russian state media. So combine Olena's analysis with that development, and where do you think it's going?
Well, Olena is correct. The prospects of a ceasefire right now are almost nil. Neither side is willing to give up what it would take to get a peace deal from the other side. And it should be remembered that even throughout the discussions where Steve Witkoff and other Trump administration officials were talking about how what a great thing it would be to have business deals with Moscow again, there was no sign that the ceasefire deal would ever lead to a long-term peace that would guarantee Ukraine's security. So I just don't see any prospect for the coming months of a ceasefire on anything approaching terms that both sides could agree to. I think the more likely scenario is continued stalemate. There is a risk of bad weather in the sense of Russia trying something desperate. But just the prospect of ceasefire at this point is not there.
Okay, let me ask Olena then on another point that Tom raised and that we also raised that developed in the last few days. There's this potential for Belarus to officially step up as an active partner on Russia's side in this conflict in order for Russia to launch more potentially effective attacks from Belarusian territory. Where would that leave Ukraine?
Well, but Belarus was used as a launchpad for Russian missiles, and also there were Russian helicopters and so on in Belarus since 2022. There were satellite images. It's all being now proven that Belarus is part of this conflict. It's also part of the Russian nuclear infrastructure. So Belarus and Ukraine, they have a kind of unwritten agreement that basically Belarus is not sending their troops to Ukraine, and Ukraine is not hitting the launch pads or whatever other stations of Russian troops that they were present in Belarus and so on. Because actually that would be a very legitimate military target for Ukraine to hit places where there is Russian equipment or Russian soldiers on Belarus territory. However, Ukraine is not at war with Belarus, and yes, it's unfortunate that Belarus is participating in the war on the Russian side. Oreshnik missile that we recently retrieved from Ukraine that was fired at us contained new components actually made in Belarus already in recent it just happened now. So they participate in sanction evasion. They do a lot of things for Russia, a lot to maintain Russia in the war. But the most important part for Ukraine is to prevent Belarusian army to have the land offensive. That's the most important thing.
Okay, it'll be interesting to see if that can be prevented. Tom, let me go back to something, more toward the beginning of all of this with you. The U.S. President Trump had promised, to end this war his first day in office, but effectively it's gotten worse. Why? Why did it actually? I mean, does it show what Russia actually really thinks of President Trump and maybe rebels a little bit in being able to? I don't think Trump feels he's been made a fool of, but others would say that.
And I can understand that. I mean, part of the problem was President Trump came in warmly disposed towards President Putin and offered him a lifeline in a number of respects. But President Putin literally slapped down every single serious initiative that President Trump had made. After the humiliating meeting between Zelensky and Trump in early 2025, everyone thought there was going to be something forced down the throats of the Ukrainian people. But that turned out not to be the case. And it turned out not to be the case partly by shrewd diplomacy on Zelensky's part, but also because of the simple fact that Trump really could not figure out how to reconcile Putin's desire to turn Ukraine into a vassal state with any kind of a deal that Ukraine could accept. And he sent envoys into the Kremlin who came back, saying things that made very little sense to most national security experts in Washington. And so no one was surprised, really, when this initiative just kept fizzling out. And every time they tried to come up with something, they realized that Putin was just not willing to accept terms that the Ukrainians could accept.
Okay.
So you can call that a strategic miscalculation if you like.
Okay.
But the reality is that a deal has never been possible because the minimal positions of both sides do not overlap.
Okay. I have to apologize again quickly. We haven't been able to connect with our guest in Moscow to get that perspective. But let me ask Olena a final question here. Meanwhile, Russia, some would say is actually basking in oil and gas profits that before had been under much stricter sanctions. Is the U.S.-Israeli war on Iran, in a sense, a dream come true for Moscow and allowing it to make that money and in many ways divert attention away from what has been happening in Ukraine?
Well, yes, of course, this war was very negative for Ukraine because, oil prices and lifting of sanctions, but also even the fact that now we don't have enough Patriot interceptor missiles to shoot down ballistic attacks of Russia. Because a lot was spent on that other war. But at the same time, look, Ukraine was able to recover from those things. And like I said, right now we are making 60% of our own weapons. We decide where we use them. And that's very important. And I think it shows that despite what Donald Trump may say about Zelensky, despite of the geopolitical situation and crisis, Ukraine has its own agency. Ukraine is an independent country, and Ukraine decides to defend itself and is able to do it in the face of all those adversities.
Tom, 1 minute left for quick comments on that issue, how the war on Iran has affected Ukraine's position here and Russia's strength.
Well, what it's done is actually one of the most ironic reversals in history. The superiority of Ukraine's drone technology has caused it to now be an export industry for Ukraine. They now have alliances with Gulf Arab countries that were undreamable in Kyiv 2 years ago. And this is going to strengthen Ukraine's future for decades to come. The partnership that is going to be built between Gulf Arab countries who need what Ukraine knows how to do is going to be lasting and is going to be one of the biggest surprises coming out of this war. Ukraine is going to end up being richer and stronger and more secure, and so will the Gulf Arab countries. No one would have predicted that in 2022.
Okay, I would love to have another program actually just based on your final analysis there. But unfortunately, we're completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. So I'd like to thank you both so much for being with me and our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.